Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. This one is going to be interesting. We got an excerpt from the American History Hit podcast about James Buchanan, the 15th president. Now,
Yeah.
he's often remembered as the president who basically let the Civil War happen, so we're going to try to unpack that and really understand his presidency, what was going on.
Yeah, it's a fascinating one because when you look at Buchanan's resume before he becomes president, it's actually really impressive. He'd been a congressman, a senator, a diplomat, secretary of state. I mean, a real political veteran.
Yeah, as a seasoned politician for sure. But then it gets kind of even more interesting because he was a Northerner from Pennsylvania, which at the time was known for having strong states' rights views. And yet he ends up leading the Democratic Party, which at the time was heavily influenced by Andrew Jackson and his emphasis on federal power. So this seems like a kind of contradiction.
It does, and then on top of that, he's already 66 when he takes office in 1857. So his whole political outlook had really been formed in a different era.
So he's coming into this presidency with all this baggage, right? And the country is on the verge of tearing itself apart. The Republican Party is gaining momentum, and their big thing, their central goal, is to stop the expansion of slavery. And this new party is really shaking things up, challenging the power structure.
And Buchanan is deeply worried by this. He sees the Republicans as a threat to national unity. And, it's worth remembering, he wins a three-way presidential race. The very fact that the vote was split three ways tells you how fragmented the political landscape was at the time.
Yeah, a sign of things to come.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's Bleeding Kansas, which is this whole fight over whether Kansas is going to be a free state or a slave state.
And the idea was to use popular sovereignty. Let the people on the territories decide.
But that backfired spectacularly. It was just violence and chaos. You have pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups fighting. It resulted in two rival governments in Kansas, two different constitutions. It was a mess.
Yeah, one of the key events in all of this is the attempt to push through the Lecompton Constitution, which was a document that was designed to protect slavery in Kansas, even if most Kansans didn't want it.
And Buchanan's decision to support this Lecompton Constitution, despite all of the controversy surrounding it, even warnings from his own appointed governor, Robert J. Walker, it just seems so baffling to us now. Like, why would he do that?
Well, he was under tremendous pressure from Southern Democrats who were increasingly powerful in the party, and they wanted the slavery issue settled in their favor, and they saw the Lecompton Constitution as a way to do that.
So he's trying to hold his party together, but it seems like he ends up making things much worse, pushing the country closer to the brink.
And it backfires dramatically. His decision splits the Democratic Party. Stephen Douglas, who is a leading Northern Democrat, openly opposes Buchanan and faces political retaliation. And ultimately, Kansas voters do reject the Lecompton Constitution. But the damage is done. The divide between North and South deepens.
And speaking of divides, let's shift gears for a minute and talk about Buchanan's personal life. He was the only president who never married. And there were all these rumors swirling around even back then about his close relationship with another politician, William Rufus King. What's the story there?
Well, we don't know for certain the exact nature of their relationship. Historical records are always incomplete. But they were definitely very close.
I think it's important to remember that ideas about male friendships were different back then, especially in the world of Washington politics. Men often had these very close, even intimate friendships that might raise eyebrows today.
Absolutely. So we can't really apply today's social norms to judge their relationship, but the rumors definitely added to the intrigue surrounding Buchanan.
Okay, back to the political turmoil. Lincoln is elected in 1860, and southern states start seceding one after another: South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama. It's a chain reaction.
Yeah, within just a few months, 7 states had left the Union.
And Buchanan's response seems to be to just point fingers.
He blames the Republicans for the crisis. He says their anti-slavery stance pushed the South to secede. And while he did acknowledge that secession was illegal, he refused to take any action to stop it.
It's just so hard to understand why he didn't do more to prevent the country from breaking apart. Why just stand by and watch it happen?
I think it goes back to his deeply held belief in a very limited role for the federal government.
Yeah.
He believed that the Union relied on this shared sense of loyalty and affection, and once that was gone, he felt there was no way to force states to stay. He called it the effective theory of union.
So he's essentially saying because people's hearts weren't in it anymore, there was no point in trying to hold the country together by force.
That seems to have been his reasoning.
Yeah.
He didn't believe in using federal power to coerce states.
Which, of course, is a stark contrast to Lincoln, who very much believed the Union was indivisible and was willing to fight to preserve it.
Absolutely. Their views on the very nature of the Union were fundamentally different.
I mean, it's almost impossible to imagine a president just letting states leave like that. And it really raises the question, could any president stop the Civil War?
Well, that's a question historians have debated for a long time. Could someone else in Buchanan's shoes have somehow changed the course of events? And it's a tough one.
Yeah, it really is. It's like a historical puzzle, right? You have all these
Mhm.
different factors, the political climate, the personalities, the economic realities, and you try to figure out, how things might have played out differently.
Exactly. There were so many deeply entrenched beliefs and interests on both sides, so much at stake.
So how do we even begin to untangle all of this?
I think we have to start by acknowledging the constraints that Buchanan faced. Remember, he was a Democrat leading a party that was increasingly dominated by Southerners. So he had to constantly balance his own personal views with the demands of his party, and the threat of secession was always looming over him.
So even if he personally, wanted to take a stronger stand against slavery, he might have faced a revolt within his own party.
Precisely. And remember, this is a time when the presidency didn't have the same kind of power it does today. The president didn't have the same tools to influence public opinion or push through his agenda.
It's interesting because we tend to think of the president as, the most powerful person in the country, but back then things were different.
Yeah, the president's role was much more limited. Congress really held a lot more sway. So Buchanan's ability to shape events was constrained.
But even with those constraints, he still made choices.
Yeah.
He chose to support the Lecompton Constitution. He chose not to use force to stop secession. Those are active decisions, not just passive responses.
You're absolutely right. And those decisions, even if they were made under pressure, had huge consequences. They fueled the crisis and made compromise even more difficult.
So maybe the question isn't could Buchanan have prevented the war, but could he have delayed it or found a more peaceful solution?
That's a good point. It's possible that a different president, someone more willing to challenge the status quo or with a different leadership style, might have handled things differently.
Someone like Lincoln, maybe. He certainly wasn't afraid to take decisive action.
It's tempting to imagine Lincoln in Buchanan's shoes, but it's all hypothetical. We can't really know for sure how he would have acted under those same pressures.
True, but Lincoln's whole view of the Union was different from Buchanan's rights. He believed that the Union was something worth fighting for, that it couldn't be broken.
That's a crucial difference. Lincoln firmly believed in the power of the federal government to preserve the nation. Buchanan, on the other hand, saw the Union as more of a voluntary agreement between states.
So even if Lincoln had been president in 1860, he might have faced those same impossible challenges. The South might have seceded anyway.
It's a real possibility. The issues of slavery and states' rights were so deeply rooted that even the most skilled politician might not have been able to overcome them.
It's almost as if the war was inevitable, this clash that had been building for decades.
Well, some historians do argue that the Civil War was an irrepressible conflict, this clash of ideologies and economic systems that could only be resolved through violence.
It makes you wonder if any individual, no matter how skilled or determined, could have really changed the tide of history.
It's a sobering thought. Individual leaders can make a difference, but they operate within a system, and sometimes the system itself is heading toward a breaking point.
So where does this leave us? What can we take away from this deep dive into Buchanan and the lead up to the Civil War?
Well, one of the biggest takeaways for me is the importance of understanding context. We can't judge historical figures solely by today's standards. We have to try to see the world through their eyes to understand the pressures they faced and the options they perceived.
It's like putting yourself in their shoes, even if those shoes are a little uncomfortable.
Exactly. It doesn't mean excusing their actions, but it does mean trying to understand why they made the choices they did. And it's also a reminder that leadership matters, even within constraints.
Even if the outcome might have been the same, different choices might have led to a different path.
That's right. And that's what makes history so fascinating. It's full of these what ifs and alternative possibilities.
It really makes you think. All right, let's pause here for a moment, and when we come back, we'll wrap up our deep dive with some final thoughts about Buchanan's legacy and what this pivotal chapter in American history can teach us today. All right, we're back for the final part of our deep dive into James Buchanan and the road to Civil War. And, we've really explored his background, the political turmoil of the time, and those really critical decisions that seem to have put the nation on this unavoidable path to war.
Yeah, and we've grappled with that question of whether any president could have actually prevented this conflict. And I think it reminds us that history is rarely straightforward. It's full of complexities and those what ifs that keep us thinking.
Yeah, definitely keeps us thinking.
Yeah.
So as we kind of wrap up, I'm curious about Buchanan's legacy.
Mm-hmm.
He's often remembered for his failures, particularly that inaction as the nation fractured. But is there a more nuanced view of his presidency? What else should we remember about him?
His legacy is complex, and as you said, often viewed negatively. He frequently ranks among the worst presidents in U.S. history. And, his handling of the secession crisis really played a significant role in shaping that assessment.
I mean, it's easy to judge him harshly from our modern perspective. But he was a product of his time, right? Influenced by the political norms and beliefs of the 19th century.
Yeah, that's crucial to remember. We can't impose our 21st century values on a leader from a different era. We have to consider the context, the pressures he faced, the political realities of his time.
So considering all of that, how should we view Buchanan's presidency within, this broader sweep of American history? What's the takeaway?
I think his presidency really serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of indecision and that vital importance of strong leadership, especially in times of crisis. He faced a tremendous challenge, and he seemed unable or unwilling to rise to the occasion.
Right. It's a reminder that even well-intentioned leaders can make choices that have disastrous consequences, whether it's through action or inaction. Sometimes not making a choice is a choice in itself.
Exactly. And it highlights just how fragile democracy can be, especially when faced with these deep divisions and those entrenched interests that seem unwilling to compromise.
That seems relevant even today, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Political polarization, unbridgeable divides.
Yeah.
So what lessons can we draw from Buchanan's mistakes? After all, we study history to learn from the past.
Absolutely. One crucial lesson, I think, is the importance of confronting difficult issues head on.
Right.
Avoiding them or trying to sweep them under the rug only makes them fester and grow. And delaying the inevitable often just makes the eventual reckoning more painful.
Like ripping off a Band-Aid, sometimes it's better to just do it quickly.
Exactly. Another lesson is the need for leaders who are willing to stand up for their convictions, even when it's unpopular or politically risky. True leadership often requires courage and a willingness to make tough choices, even when those choices might alienate some.
Right. It takes a certain fortitude to go against the grain, especially when the stakes are so high.
Mm.
And it makes you wonder, would Buchanan have been remembered differently if he had taken a bolder stand, even if it meant fracturing his party or facing defeat?
That's a fascinating question. Would a more assertive approach have actually changed the outcome? We can't know for sure, but it underscores the enduring power of leadership.
Yeah, and I think Buchanan's presidency also underscores that vital importance of unity and compromise in a democracy. When divisions become too deep and entrenched, when dialogue breaks down, it can really lead to devastating consequences.
Yeah, and we see that throughout history, don't we? The breakdown of communication and understanding that unwillingness to find common ground, it rarely ends well.
And it seems especially relevant in our own time with so much division and polarization. Buchanan's story really reminds us that we need to find ways to bridge our differences and work together, to recognize that we have more in common than what divides us.
Well said. Even though Buchanan's presidency is often seen as a failure, I think it offers some valuable lessons for us today. It prompts us to consider the qualities of leadership, the importance of compromise, and the fragility of democracy.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
It's been a really eye-opening exploration of a pivotal and often overlooked chapter in American history. So huge thank you to you for guiding us through this deep dive. It's given me, and I'm sure our listeners, a lot to think about.
It's been my pleasure. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope it sparked your curiosity about this complex and fascinating period in our history, and maybe even inspired you to learn more.
Keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions, and keep diving deep into the stories that shape our world. And until next time, happy diving.